There are stories hidden in American history that were never meant to be found. Some are buried under courthouse floors. Some are burned in quiet fires that no one reports. And some, like this one, survive by accident as if the past itself refuses to stay silent. If you live anywhere in the South, especially in Virginia, what you hear today may change the way you look at your own county forever. Because this story begins with 37 children recorded as white in the 1790s. Children who shared the same father. A man who was legally owned by the people who claimed to be their parents. Before we go any further, remember this name that appears in those records only once. Number 47. His existence should have never been written down. Yet it was. And what he left behind still scares the people who tried to erase him. Part 1. Somewhere in the wide tobacco counties of eastern Virginia, there is a courthouse that once held documents no one could explain. Birth records from the 1790s, written neatly in iron gall ink, listing the names of children born to some of the wealthiest families in the region. Nothing about that seemed strange at first. Rich families kept good records. Rich families liked everything official. But these records had something that turned stomachs cold in the historians who found them a century later. 37 white children, 37 different mothers, one biological father, a father who had no last name, no rights, no legal identity. He was listed only by a number. Number 47. Property. Those records survived 2 fires, a courthouse flood, and 3 sealed orders. The clerks who tried to hide them in 1889 said they misplaced them. But the historians who first saw them swore that the pages were removed in the middle of the night. No one ever found them again. What was written in those pages showed a truth that powerful families wanted forgotten. But the story does not start in the courthouse. It begins on the banks of the Rappahannock River in 1774, where land and people were measured the same way. In acres, in dollars, in ownership. Eastern Virginia during that time looked beautiful on the outside, like a painting meant for display. Tall white plantation houses rose above fields of tobacco that stretched into the distance like rows of green soldiers. Wind moved through those fields like a whisper filled with secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Out of 8,000 people living in the county, only 2,000 were counted as fully human by law. Everyone else existed in ledgers and inventories. Their lives priced like tools. The Warfield plantation was one of the grandest properties along the river. 1,200 acres of rich bottomland. A 3-story Georgian house that took 7 years to build. A structure meant to show the world that the Warfields were more than wealthy. They were powerful. Marcus Warfield, the master of the estate in 1774, was 31 years old. Educated at William and Mary. Sharp, handsome, confident, the type of man whose voice carried across a room and made people listen. He had inherited the plantation unexpectedly after the death of his brother. Along with land and money came 93 enslaved workers and a long list of debts. Clearing those debts became his life's work. His wife, Catherine, was 26. Delicate in her features, a woman raised in Charleston society, fluent in French, and perfectly trained in the traits expected of a wife of her standing. She was polite and poised, yet emotionally distant from Marcus. Their marriage was not filled with affection, but it was stable. They had one daughter. People whispered about that too. A single child in 5 years. A fact small enough to ignore, yet large enough to raise quiet questions. 12 enslaved workers served as house staff. Cooks, a nurse, a coachman, maids, a valet. They lived behind the main house in small brick quarters, close enough to hear the bell that summoned them. Close enough to feel the tension inside the house even when the doors were closed. In the summer of 1774, Marcus traveled to Richmond and made a purchase that stunned even his overseers. He bought a young man around 20 years old. Very tall, strong, broad-shouldered. His features suggested a bloodline that was not purely African. Maybe mixed ancestry. Maybe several generations mixed. The bill of sale did not bother with details. It listed one male, healthy, suitable for field work. But Marcus did something no one expected. He placed the young man in the house, not the fields. He was assigned heavy tasks around the main house and given a work name by the steward. Joseph. His presence made the household uneasy at first. Though he spoke little, people noticed him. His quiet movements, his strength, his calm expression, his eyes that never looked down even when he was required to. Catherine noticed him as well. That part no one would admit in the open, but everyone felt. At first her interactions with Joseph were innocent. A request for help moving furniture. Instructions given directly instead of through the steward. Small changes, quiet adjustments, but those changes became patterns. Patterns that only the careful observers among the house staff noticed. The first pregnancy came in the spring of 1775. Marcus celebrated loudly, delighted that he might finally have a son. Catherine delivered a healthy boy with pale skin and dark eyes. They named him Marcus Jr. No one questioned the birth. But the enslaved women in the quarters whispered. They whispered about the timing. The father's long absences from the plantation. The way Catherine watched Joseph when she thought no one was looking. Within 6 years Catherine gave birth to 5 children. All healthy, all strong, all unusually robust for the time. 30% of plantation children died before the age of 5. But not the Warfield children. Neighbors congratulated Marcus on his impressive luck. They smiled at him politely. In private, their smiles faded into confusion. Then the whispers spread. A cousin, a neighbor, a woman who could not conceive for years suddenly pregnant after requesting Joseph's help on her estate. A second woman, a third, children born in different houses. Children who resembled each other more than they resembled their supposed fathers. No one dared speak the truth, because to speak it would threaten everything the county believed it was built upon. 37 children, one father, a man who existed only as number 47. The story of how this happened. The story they tried to erase. That begins now. Part 2. The father no one could name. Hook. There is a moment in every buried secret when silence becomes dangerous. For 20 years the families of Eastern Virginia believed they had constructed a perfect arrangement, a system so controlled and so quiet that no outsider would ever see what was happening. But secrets leave shadows even when buried deep. And by the early 1790s, those shadows began slipping across the county line, touching the wrong eyes, unsettling the wrong visitors. What began with whispered rumors inside the quarters was now shaping the fates of powerful families. But the heart of it all remained one man. A man whose name was never spoken in public. A man who carried the futures of 7 white families inside him. The records called him Joseph. The whispers called him something else. The father no one could name. Part 2. In Virginia during the 18th century, the law was simple and cruel. Children inherited the status of their mother. If the mother was white and married, the child became white and legitimate. The biological father did not matter. Blood did not matter. Only the mother's status shaped the identity of the child in the eyes of the law. That was the shield that protected the planter families. And it was the weapon that allowed them to create a system that should not have been possible. By the time Joseph had lived on the Warfield estate for 15 years, the pattern was visible to everyone who worked in the fields and the houses. Requests would come from other plantations. A woman was expecting a difficult season. Heavy work required strong hands. Marcus Warfield would approve the request. Joseph would be sent with proper documentation and a polite note describing his skills. He would work at that estate for weeks or months. And then he would return to the Warfield plantation in silence. A year later, a child would be born. By 1790, 23 children had appeared across 7 different planter families. All white, all legitimate, all carrying the names of their supposed fathers. The county clerk saw nothing strange about it. From his perspective, the region was simply experiencing a period of prosperity and high birth rates. But inside the enslaved community, the story was different. They kept their own oral records. They watched. They whispered. They marked each birth on a mental calendar that no white person ever asked to see. Joseph himself moved through the county like a quiet force. He was always fed well. Always clothed well. Always treated with a strange respect that confused the other enslaved workers. He was not worked to exhaustion. He was not hired out for cash. He was kept available, kept safe, kept close to the Warfields. It became obvious to those who paid attention that he held a value beyond anything in the ledgers. The fragile balance of this silent arrangement almost collapsed in 1791. A merchant from Pennsylvania came to the county on business. He was not familiar with Southern customs. He did not understand the dangerous etiquette of Virginia society. When he saw Joseph traveling with Catherine Warfield on a private trip to Richmond, he made the mistake of speaking casually. He told Marcus that Joseph seemed unusually attentive to Catherine. The words were innocent, but the room changed when he spoke them. The air tightened. The merchant later wrote that Marcus's smile never left his face, but something about his eyes became sharp. Marcus explained with cold politeness that Joseph was loyal, that the household trusted him, that Virginia had its own way of doing things that strangers would not understand. The merchant said no more. He sensed, even without understanding, that he had stepped into something he was not supposed to see. After that encounter, the rumors inside the quarters became whispers of fear. People said the merchant had been escorted out of the county early. Some said he was warned never to return. Others said he left on his own after realizing the truth. The truth that 7 planter families had children who looked more alike than cousins should. The truth that Joseph's face lived inside the faces of dozens of white children. By the mid-1790s the pattern was clear even among the white elite. At social gatherings the planter families brought their children. People noticed the same curve in the jaw, the same arch in the eyebrows, the same height, the same strong shoulders in boys barely 12 years old. These similarities connected families who were supposed to be separate. The whispers grew louder in private rooms. Conversations paused when strangers walked by. Still, the families said nothing. To speak would tear everything apart. The Warfields had the most to lose. Catherine had produced 11 children by 1795. 11 strong, healthy children who would inherit land, money, and political power. The Bradfords had 4 by then. The Suttons had 6. 3 other families had added several. 37 children in all. Children who would one day run the county. Joseph continued to age into a life that defied the laws of slavery. He lived in quarters better than some overseers. He was fed well enough to maintain his strength. He never complained. He never spoke openly. People wondered whether he fully understood what he had become to these families. Others believed he knew everything and carried it like a stone in his chest. When a slave trader arrived in 1794 and offered Marcus a fortune for Joseph, the entire conspiracy nearly collapsed. Marcus refused, but the attempt frightened the other planters. They realized that if Joseph was ever sold outside the county, everything would be exposed. They visited Marcus. They insisted the arrangement continue. They offered financial help. They created loans disguised as favors. They did whatever was necessary to keep Joseph exactly where he was. Still, the secret had begun to strain. Tobacco prices fell. Warfield finances collapsed. The estate posted a sale list in Richmond in 1799. 30 enslaved people to be sold. Their names printed in ink. Their ages and skills described for buyers. Joseph was on the list. The planter families panicked. They visited the Warfield estate in a frenzy. They argued. They demanded. They whispered in locked rooms. And suddenly Joseph's name vanished from the sale list. The plantation debt was quietly covered by several prominent families. The conspirators restored the balance. But in doing so they revealed how fragile their system really was. That was when Catherine proposed the idea that changed everything. Joseph must be freed. Not for justice. Not for mercy. But for control. Freeing him meant he could never be sold. It meant the secret would stay in the county. It meant the arrangement could continue without fear of collapse. The manumission papers were written in January 1800. They described Joseph as a faithful servant. They required him to remain at the Warfield estate. They offered him $60 a year. They were signed by Marcus. They were signed by witnesses. They required Joseph to make his mark. He made an X. A single mark that changed his status but not his life. The record says nothing about what Joseph felt when he pressed the quill into the parchment. Nothing about whether he understood the chains he still carried. Nothing about whether he feared the families who depended on him. Silence is all that remains. And that silence is about to break. Part 3, The Mark That Couldn't Be Erased. Engaging hook. Sometimes a secret grows so large that even the walls of a house cannot hold it. Sometimes it whispers through the halls, slips under locked doors, and finds its way into the minds of the living. By the year 1800, the secret at the Warfield estate no longer belonged to the adults who created it. It had begun to live inside their children. And secrets that live inside children never stay quiet for long. Part 3. The papers required his signature, or what passed for one. Joseph had never learned to write. So his freedom, the most important moment of his life, was marked only with a simple X. It was strange to watch such a small mark hold so much weight. It changed his legal status forever, yet changed almost nothing about his daily life. He still woke before the sun. He still worked for the families. He still had no voice in the matters that shaped him. What Joseph thought about any of this will never be known. The world kept no record of his feelings. He left no letters and no written testimony. The only proof of his acceptance was his continued presence on the Warfield estate. He stayed, he worked, and the women of the planter families continued to visit him in secret. Between 1800 and 1804, 5 more children were born in the connected families. With these births, the total number of Joseph's children reached 42. 37 survived past infancy. These children were treated as full white Virginians. They were educated. They owned property. Some attended the College of William and Mary. The daughters married into respected families. They became mothers in homes full of servants and wealth. Yet their lives carried a silent contradiction. Their biological father was the one person they could never claim. It was the hidden truth behind their pale skin, their social status, and their place in the world. Everyone in the families knew the truth. No one dared speak it. In 1803 something happened that showed how fragile their silence truly was. Elizabeth Warfield, the 4th daughter of Catherine and now a 17-year-old young woman, learned the truth by accident. She overheard house servants talking about her real parentage. She confronted her mother in a moment so loud and powerful that several people in the house heard it through the walls. Yet none ever shared the exact words spoken that night. Only the aftermath was known. Elizabeth was sent to live with relatives in Charleston. She stayed there for 2 years. When she returned, she never mentioned the matter again. Her face remained calm. Her voice stayed controlled. But something in her eyes seemed changed forever. She soon married a young man from Williamsburg and left Virginia for good. Her outburst frightened the families more deeply than they admitted. If one child discovered the secret, others might too. And if those children grew up and had children, the families worried that biology itself would expose them. What if a child was born with features that raised questions? What if a traveling doctor noticed something? What if a portrait artist saw too much? The wealthy planters had built their reputations on purity and lineage. The truth threatened to tear all of it apart. The year 1806 brought a danger none of them expected. After Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, Virginia passed harsh new laws against free black people. Anyone freed after a certain date had to leave the state within 1 year unless the county court granted special permission. Joseph had been freed in 1800. By law he should have left by 1801. He had not left. He still lived on the Warfield estate. And now a new sheriff named Howell began asking questions. They were simple questions but dangerous ones. Why was Joseph still in the county? Who had allowed it? Under what authority did he remain? Thomas Bradford and Edmund Sutton grew nervous. Marcus Warfield, now 68 and in failing health, knew they had to act quickly. He went before the county court and filed a petition requesting special permission for Joseph to stay. The wording in the petition was vague. It said Joseph had performed services to several families, and that his departure would create considerable hardship. It did not say what those services were. It did not list which families were burdened. 6 white plantation heads signed it. It was an unusual level of support for a free black man at a time when fear and suspicion filled every conversation about race. The court approved the petition without argument. But the damage was done. People in the county were already whispering about why such powerful men cared so deeply about one freed servant. Catherine understood that the families needed another layer of protection. She arranged for something bold and public. Joseph would be baptized into the Anglican Church. It was a ceremony that carried moral weight in a society built on religion. The county's most respected minister performed the baptism. Members of every involved family attended. To outsiders the message was simple. Joseph was a man of faith and character. He belonged in their community. But inside the households the tension deepened. Questions were still rising in town. A portrait painter visiting the families in 1808 whispered to his assistant that many of the younger children looked curiously alike. A doctor in 1809 privately wrote that certain families showed signs of mixed heritage despite appearing white. These observations were never made public, but rumors spread fast in rural Virginia. The secret was beginning to slip. Then in 1810 the most dangerous moment yet arrived. One of the Bradford sons returned from Philadelphia after 3 years of study. He stood up at a family dinner and announced he had become an abolitionist. He planned to free every enslaved person he had inherited. He wanted to speak openly against slavery. His father reacted with panic. He pulled his son into his study and shut the door. No one knows what he said. But when the young man came out his face was pale. He looked hollow, shaken, broken. Within a week he left Virginia forever. He moved to Ohio and never spoke of his family again. Most believed his father revealed the truth. That he was Joseph's son. That speaking out against slavery would uncover the scandal their families had hidden for decades. The young man carried the weight of that knowledge for the rest of his life. By 1812 the pressure on the families was unbearable. And then Marcus Warfield died. His death marked the beginning of the unraveling. The foggy morning funeral brought every prominent family together. Servants lined the path. Joseph stood among them, not belonging to either world. Catherine wept at the grave, but her tears felt strained, as if she were mourning more than a husband. She was mourning the end of control. When the will was read the atmosphere changed from grief to shock. The attorney announced a codicil. Marcus left Joseph $5,000, a huge sum and an impossible gift to explain. The room went completely silent. And with that silence the long-buried truth finally began to rise. Part 4. The shadows that followed the money. Engaging hook. Every family has a moment when the truth stops hiding and begins hunting. For the Warfields and their allies that moment came not with a scream or a confession but with a number. 5,000. A sum so large and so impossible that it spread through the house like cold smoke. And once that smoke entered the rooms and hearts of these families it refused to leave. Part 4. The reading of Marcus Warfield's will should have been simple. The man had lived a long life. He had shaped the county. He had buried enemies and outlived friends. His children expected the usual arrangements. Land, money, livestock, dowries, favors owed, nothing more. But when the codicil was read the room changed. The air felt heavier. The windows seemed to draw in the fog from outside. The family sat frozen as the attorney repeated the words. To the faithful servant Joseph the first leave $5,000. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly. Even the fire in the fireplace seemed to soften its crackle as if it too were listening. The attorney glanced around the room waiting for someone to respond. Catherine's hands tightened on her lap. Her children looked at her and then at each other. They knew this gift was dangerous. It was a public sign of a private truth. People could question the amount. They could wonder why an aging planter had such affection for a man who was supposed to be only a servant. They could suspect things that had been hidden for decades. Marcus Jr. stood up first. His face was stiff. His voice was controlled. He asked the attorney why his father had written such a thing. Havisham looked uneasy. He admitted the codicil had been added only months before Marcus died. He said the old man had insisted on it. He had said it was a matter of fairness and gratitude. The attorney had not argued because Marcus's mind, though tired, had remained sharp. The younger children exchanged glances. Fairness and gratitude were not enough to explain such a fortune. There were overseers who had given 30 years of loyal service who had never received more than a new pair of boots or a good coat. A cold fear crept into Catherine's heart. She felt it tightening around her ribs. She feared that the last protection Marcus had provided had been removed with his death. The families once moved in quiet unity. Now they were scattered branches of a dying tree. Without Marcus to hold them together, the secret that lived in their blood was beginning to wake. After the reading, the family retreated to different rooms. Some whispered. Some argued behind closed doors. Some walked outside pretending to admire the blooming dogwoods while their minds raced. Joseph remained silent. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, unsure whether he should leave or stay. The amount of money terrified him. It was enough to buy land. It was enough to make him a target. He never asked for it, and now it felt like a curse wrapped in gold. That night Catherine called him into her private parlor. Her eyes were tired. Her body seemed smaller than usual. She told Joseph that things had changed. She said the others were worried about him. She said the money would bring attention they could no longer control. Joseph listened without speaking. He had learned long ago that silence protected him better than any law. She told him he would need to be careful. He could not leave the estate without telling her. He should avoid the courthouse. He should avoid conversations with strangers. Joseph nodded. He had been living carefully his whole life. This was nothing new. But the next week the questions began. People in town had heard about the strange bequest. The sheriff had heard it. The minister had heard it. The widows in the sewing circle had heard it. The old men who sat outside the tavern had heard it. Money always traveled faster than truth. Rumors grew. Some said Joseph had saved Marcus's life in the past. Some said Marcus had made a promise to Joseph's mother. Others whispered darker stories. They wondered why so many children in the connected families had similar features. They wondered why an old man would give a servant such a gift. They wondered why Catherine seemed so protective of a man who was not related to her. The whispering became so constant that even the quiet rooms of the Warfield mansion could not keep it out. The house staff repeated the stories in the kitchen. The stable boys repeated them in the barn. The enslaved workers heard them and paused in their tasks. They had known for years something strange was happening among the white families. Now they felt the truth pressing against the walls. One evening a neighbor named Jasper Quinn arrived uninvited. He claimed he had come to offer sympathy for the loss of Marcus. But his eyes searched the rooms with a hungry curiosity. He asked where Joseph was. He said he wished to speak to him. His tone was smooth. His words were polite, yet something cold lived beneath them. Joseph kept out of sight. Catherine refused to let Quinn speak to him. She said Joseph was ill, though this was a lie. Quinn smiled in a way that suggested he did not believe her. He left with slow steps as if waiting for someone to stop him and confess. 3 days later the Bradford family arrived in a panic. They said they had heard that people were asking questions about Joseph's parentage. They said the town was restless. They reminded Catherine that their children too were part of this secret. Catherine knew what they feared. If one truth was revealed, it would lead to another and then another until the whole story came crashing down. That night a storm came. The rain fell hard and the sky roared. In the middle of the storm Joseph heard a soft knock at the door of his small room behind the kitchen. When he opened it he saw Elizabeth. The same Elizabeth who had learned the truth years before. The same Elizabeth who had been sent away and returned colder than before. Her face was pale. Her dress was soaked from the rain. She said she had come because she felt something dark rising in the house. She said she could not sleep because she heard whispers in the hallway. She said she felt that someone was watching the family with cruel interest. Before Joseph could speak she grabbed his arm. Her voice shook. She said the secret was waking. She said the walls of the house could no longer hold it. She said someone was going to force the truth into the light. The storm grew louder. The candles flickered, and for a moment Joseph thought he heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, slow, determined, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who knew a truth so powerful it could destroy them all. Part 5, The Night the Whispers Found a Voice. Engaging hook. Secrets break in different ways. Some explode with shouting, some crumble slowly like rotten wood, and some whisper, soft enough to be ignored at first, soft enough to deny. But eventually the whisper becomes a voice. And once a voice begins to speak inside a house there is no way to silence it again. Part 5. The storm that night shook the entire Warfield estate. Rain struck the windows like thrown gravel. Wind pushed against the shutters until they rattled. The trees on the property bent and swayed as if something invisible walked among them. Inside the mansion the halls felt colder than they should have felt. Even the candles seemed softer, afraid to burn too brightly. Joseph stood in the doorway of his small room staring at Elizabeth as she shivered from the rain. Her hair clung to her face. Her eyes were wide with fear. She repeated the same words again. She said the secret inside the family was waking. She said she had heard someone moving through the halls late at night. Someone who was not supposed to be there. Joseph told her to come inside. He wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her hands trembling on her knees. For years Elizabeth had kept the truth locked deep within herself. Now it seemed to seep out like water through cracks in old stone. She said she had returned to Virginia only because her mother begged her. She said she had lived peacefully in Charleston with relatives who never questioned her past. But in the Warfield home she felt something dark pressing against her every time she walked through the hallways. She said she felt watched even when she was alone. The rain grew louder. A distant clap of thunder shook the window glass. Joseph turned to check the shutters. When he turned back Elizabeth had risen to her feet. She stared at the door to the hallway with an expression Joseph did not understand. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said someone was standing outside. Joseph quietly opened the door. The hallway was empty. Only darkness waited. He stepped out and listened. The house groaned as the storm pulled at its roof. Water dripped somewhere far off. But there were no footsteps. No voices. No shadows. Joseph returned to the room and assured Elizabeth that no one was outside. But she only shook her head. She said the person had already left. She said the person moved without sound. She said the person knew how to hide. Her words unsettled him. Elizabeth had always been the most observant of Catherine's daughters. She had discovered the truth earlier than anyone else. And that truth had nearly destroyed her. Joseph wondered if her mind was simply burdened with too much memory. But a part of him sensed there was something else at work. Something that had been building inside the house for years. Later that night Elizabeth fell asleep in a chair near the hearth. Joseph remained awake. He listened to the wind and waited for the storm to end. But sometime after midnight he heard it. A sound inside the house. Slow, careful, heavy footsteps. They were not the light steps of children. They were not the hurried steps of servants. These footsteps moved with purpose. Each one sounded as if the floorboards groaned in recognition. Joseph stood and listened. The steps traveled down the hallway. They paused near the kitchen door. Then they moved again and began climbing the stairs to the second floor. This was not the first time Joseph had heard strange steps in the night. For years he had sensed movement in the house when no one was awake. He often told himself it was only the settling of old wood or the shifting of the wind. But tonight the sound was too clear. Too real. He moved quietly into the hallway and looked up the staircase. He saw nothing at first. Then he noticed a faint shape near the landing. It was not a person. Not exactly. It was more like a shadow shaped like a person. A shadow that did not belong to anything or anyone. He blinked and it vanished. The staircase was empty again. Joseph returned to his room and sat in the chair across from Elizabeth. His heart pounded in his chest. He thought about the strange events of the past year. The portrait artist who noticed the children's resemblance. The physician who saw features he could not explain. The young Bradford son who had fled the state after learning a truth too heavy to carry. And now Elizabeth with her trembling voice and haunted eyes. A pattern was forming, and it was a pattern that pointed toward danger. Near dawn the storm ended. A weak gray light seeped through the curtains. Elizabeth woke and looked around as if she had already forgotten half the night. She asked Joseph if she had spoken in her sleep. He said she had not. She seemed relieved but still shaken. Catherine arrived at the door just after sunrise. Her face was pale from worry. When she saw Elizabeth safe she let out a trembling sigh. But when she saw Joseph sitting there she stiffened. The old fear returned to her eyes. Fear that the secret they shared would break loose. Elizabeth told her mother everything. The footsteps. The sense of being watched. The silent figure on the landing. Catherine's lips tightened. She did not question Elizabeth. She did not accuse her of imagining things. She simply listened in silence. Finally Catherine said something that surprised both of them. She said the house remembered things. She said that when people keep secrets for too long, the walls begin to hold those secrets like trapped breath. She said silence has weight, and their silence had grown too heavy. She asked Joseph to walk with her to the family cemetery behind the house. Elizabeth stayed behind. The morning dew clung to the grass as Joseph and Catherine moved past the cold stone markers. Catherine stopped at the grave of Marcus Warfield. She touched the top of the stone. Her hand shook. She told Joseph that Marcus had feared something near the end. She said he believed that some truths refused to stay buried. She said he feared the families were being haunted not by spirits but by their own sins. Joseph felt a chill move up his spine. It was not the cold morning air. It was the feeling that Catherine was right. The secret had lived too long. It had grown too large. And now it was becoming something alive. Catherine turned to him and said there were things still hidden. Things even Joseph did not know. She said part of the story had been kept from him. And she said the time had come for him to learn what waited in the shadows of his own past. Before Joseph could ask what she meant, they both heard it. Footsteps again. Slow. Heavy. Too close. Catherine's face turned white. Joseph spun toward the trees. But no one stood there. The sound came from behind them. From inside the cemetery. From near Marcus Warfield's grave. And the next moment a shadow moved that should not have moved at all. Part 6. The grave that breathed. Engaging hook. Every family hides something. Every house keeps its secrets. But graves are different. Graves are supposed to stay silent. They are supposed to protect the living from what lies beneath. Yet on that cold Virginia morning the earth itself seemed to exhale. And the sound that rose from Marcus Warfield's burial site was not the wind. It was something older. Something angry. Something that had finally woken up. Part 6. Joseph froze where he stood. The sound that came from behind him was soft at first. A shifting of dirt. A settling of stone. The kind of sound a person hears when someone steps gently onto loose ground. Catherine raised a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes widened with terror. The morning seemed to stop breathing. Joseph turned slowly toward the Warfield family graves. The fog still clung to the earth, drifting between headstones like pale smoke. For a moment there was nothing. Only stillness. Then the ground at Marcus Warfield's grave moved again. This time more clearly, as if something pushed from below. Catherine whispered that this was wrong. She said graves do not move. She said the dead do not return. But her voice was thin and soft. Even she did not seem convinced. Joseph stepped forward in small careful movements. He felt the old fear he had carried for so long rise inside him like cold water. Fear of being property. Fear of being punished. Fear of whispers that created danger with every breath. But now the fear was different. This fear came from something unseen yet close enough to touch. The soil at the grave shifted again. A slow bulge lifted the earth. The stone slab at the head leaned forward just a fraction. Joseph felt his heartbeat pounding in his throat. He told Catherine to stay back. She did not argue. She simply pressed a hand against her chest as if holding her heart in place. A crow cawed sharply from a nearby tree. The sound cut through the air like a blade. The bulging soil settled suddenly. Then silence. Joseph waited. Catherine waited. The entire cemetery seemed to wait. Then a sound rose from beneath the earth. A low muffled groan. It was not a voice. Not entirely. It was the sound of air forced through a place where air should not be. Catherine stumbled backward. She whispered that this was a sign. She said the secret had become a curse. She said the shame buried in this land was rising. Joseph knelt beside the disturbed grave. He placed a hand on the cold stone. He heard nothing now. He told Catherine it might have been the storm. The ground was wet and soft. Maybe the soil had shifted. But he did not believe it. And neither did she. Before either could say more, they heard footsteps approaching from outside the cemetery. Not the heavy unnatural steps from the night before. Human footsteps. Fast. Urgent. It was Thomas Bradford's wife. Eleanor. Her dress was soaked from the damp grass. She looked almost wild with fear. She said Catherine must come at once. Something had happened at the Bradford estate. Another child. One of the grandchildren. A girl of 8 years old. She had woken screaming in the night. She said she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed. Not a person. Not a ghost. Something in between. She said it had no face, but somehow she recognized it. She said it felt like family. The girl fainted and had not woken since. Catherine looked at Joseph with a trembling breath. She said the shadow in the Warfield house was not the only one. She said the curse had begun to spread among all the families tied to their secret. They hurried from the cemetery. Joseph stayed behind for a moment. He glanced back at Marcus Warfield's grave. The soil was flat now. The stone stood straight again. The fog drifted gently across the grass. It looked peaceful. It looked ordinary. But Joseph knew what he had seen. And what he had heard. As he walked away, he felt something brush against his ankle. Like the touch of a cold fingertip. He did not look back. When he reached the house, Catherine was waiting at the carriage with Eleanor Bradford. The horses were restless. Their ears twitched at every sound. Catherine said Joseph must come with them. She said the Bradfords needed him. Joseph wanted to refuse. He felt unsafe at the thought of being near so many people who now whispered behind closed doors. But Catherine insisted. She said this was happening because of him. She said he had a right to know everything. The ride to the Bradford estate took less than 15 minutes but felt like an hour. The fields passed by in gray silence. The river shimmered with a pale morning light. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and dead leaves. As they approached the Bradford home, Joseph saw several servants gathered outside the front door. Their faces were stiff with fear. Inside the house the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The Bradford girl lay in a small bedroom on the second floor. Her hands rested on her chest. Her eyes remained closed. A faint tremor moved through her body every few minutes. Eleanor Bradford said the physician had come and left. He found no fever, no injury, no explanation. Joseph stepped closer. The girl's lips moved slightly. Her voice was barely a whisper. It sounded like she was speaking to someone who stood very close. Joseph leaned in to listen. She whispered Joseph's name. He stumbled back. Catherine pressed both hands to her mouth. The room seemed to pull inward, as if the air tightened around them. The girl kept whispering, over and over, "Joseph, Joseph." Catherine whispered that the connection had become too strong. She said the secret had bled into the next generation. She said the truth was not content to sleep anymore. Joseph asked what the child had seen the night before. Eleanor Bradford said the girl had described a tall shape. A dark shape. A shape that stood perfectly still but watched her with eyes she could not see. She said the shape leaned forward and whispered something. Joseph asked what. Eleanor hesitated. Her face went pale. She said the child told her that the shape said one sentence. "The truth belongs to him." Joseph felt the world tilt. He felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Catherine reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold. Outside, another storm began forming in the sky. Dark clouds rolled low over the fields. A rising wind shook the trees. Thunder rumbled far in the distance, steady and angry. Catherine looked at Joseph and said there was something she should have told him years ago. Something that Marcus had warned her never to speak. Something buried deeper than any grave. Joseph asked what it was. Catherine said she would tell him. But only if he was ready to learn who number 47 really was. And why the dead had begun to rise for him. Part 7. Engaging hook. Some nights carry a silence so deep that it feels alive. On this night, inside the old manor, that silence finally spoke, and it called someone's name. The storm from the previous night had passed, but its memory still clung to the air. The sky was gray and heavy. Every tree around the manor leaned as if it wanted to whisper a warning. Inside the house, the air felt cold enough to make anyone shiver, even without a breeze. Eleanor had barely slept. Her mind kept replaying the moment she saw the shadow behind the curtain in the hallway. She had convinced herself it was her imagination, but a part of her wondered if the house was now watching her. She stood at the window, staring at the long dirt road outside. It stretched out like a lonely brown ribbon, leading into the woods. When she heard footsteps behind her, she tensed. It was only Margaret, carrying a candle even though it was morning. Margaret looked tired, her eyes dark and restless. "We need to talk," Margaret whispered. Her voice seemed too soft, too worried. Eleanor nodded. She knew Margaret had been keeping something inside. It was written all over her face. They walked to the dining room where the others waited. Thomas, Gerald, and little Ruth sat at the long wooden table. Their breakfast plates were untouched. Everyone looked uneasy. Eleanor felt her heart sink a little. Something was wrong. Something big. Margaret finally spoke. I found something in the cellar last night. The room fell silent. Everyone waited. Margaret placed a small object on the table. It was a thin wooden token, carved with strange symbols. Eleanor leaned forward and felt a chill move through her body. The symbols looked ancient and wrong, like marks made for dark rituals. Where did you find it? Gerald asked. Margaret looked down. In the dirt near the back wall. And it was not alone. I found pieces of old rope too. And stains. She swallowed hard. Stains that looked like blood. No one spoke for a moment. The house seemed to lean in, listening. Thomas tapped the table nervously. Maybe it is old. Maybe this place has a violent past. Many houses do. Margaret shook her head. This felt recent. The dirt was loose, the rope was not decayed. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. Someone had been doing something in that cellar recently. She remembered the shadow, the cold air, the strange footsteps in the hallway at night. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, little Ruth whispered something that made everyone freeze. I saw someone in the yard last night. The adults stared at her. You what? Eleanor whispered. Ruth nodded. I woke up because I heard humming. A woman's humming. I looked outside and I saw someone standing near the old oak tree. She looked like she was waiting for someone. Eleanor felt every hair on her arms rise. Did she see you? Gerald asked. Ruth shook her head. I do not think so. She was just staring at the house. She did not blink. Thomas stood up abruptly. We need to check outside. We cannot let strange people just walk around the property. Margaret grabbed his arm. No, nobody goes alone. We stay together, do you understand? This place is not safe. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. They all moved toward the front door. The wood creaked as they pushed it open. The morning air hit them like a cold hand. The yard was quiet, but the ground near the oak tree did look disturbed. Fresh prints. Someone had been standing there. And watching. Eleanor walked closer, her breath shaking. The footprints were small, too small for a man. Too delicate. A woman, just like Ruth said. Gerald bent down and touched the earth. It is fresh, less than a day. But then something caught Margaret's eye. Look at the tree, she whispered. There was something carved into the bark. A circle with a cross through it, cut deep and rough. The same strange pattern on the wooden token. Eleanor's chest tightened. She stepped back, feeling something stir inside her. There was a connection forming, like pieces of a puzzle she did not want to understand. Suddenly a loud sound echoed from the house. A sharp crash. Everyone jumped. The sound had come from the upstairs hallway. Thomas ran toward the house, the others following close behind. As they entered the hallway, they saw it. A picture frame had fallen from the wall and shattered on the floor. But that was not what made Eleanor stop breathing. The picture inside the frame had changed. It was supposed to show the original owners of the manor. A family of 5 standing proudly in front of the house. But now the faces were scratched out. Deep, angry lines cut through every single face. Who did that? Gerald whispered. No one had an answer. The air grew colder. Eleanor felt something behind her, like a faint breath on the back of her neck. She turned quickly, but nothing was there. Then Ruth screamed. Everyone turned to her. She was pointing down the hallway. At the far end stood a figure. A woman, long black dress, pale face, shadowed eyes, standing perfectly still, watching them. Eleanor gasped. Margaret grabbed Ruth. Thomas stepped forward, but in the blink of an eye, the woman vanished. Just gone, like she had never been there. The hallway fell silent again. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She whispered a single thought that everyone else was thinking too. She is inside the house. And she has been waiting a long time. Part 8. Engaging hook. Sometimes a house does not just keep secrets. Sometimes it protects them. And anyone who tries to uncover the truth becomes part of the darkness hiding inside its walls. The house felt different after they saw the woman in the hallway. It was no longer silent in a normal way. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, the kind that made the heart beat louder in the ears. Eleanor stood near the staircase, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to steady her breath. She could still picture the woman standing there, watching them with eyes that looked both empty and aware. Margaret locked every window on the first floor, her movements quick and nervous. Thomas checked the front and back doors twice, muttering under his breath. Gerald sat in a chair with one hand on Ruth's shoulder, trying to calm her, but his own leg kept bouncing with fear. "We need answers," Eleanor finally said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "We cannot stay here without knowing what is happening. Someone used this house for something dark. Someone is still using it." Margaret looked up, her face pale but serious. "Then we start with the cellar. There is more down there." "I know it." Thomas hesitated. "That place is dangerous. It feels wrong." "Everything here feels wrong," Eleanor replied. "But the cellar is the heart of it." Margaret lit a lantern. The warm glow pushed back some of the darkness around them, but only a little. The five of them gathered at the cellar door, which groaned loudly when Thomas pulled it open. The air that rose from below was cold and damp. Ruth held onto Gerald tightly. "Stay close to me," he whispered to her. They stepped down the wooden steps slowly. Each step creaked in a long, tired moan. The cellar was larger than Eleanor remembered. The lantern light revealed stone walls, old barrels, and broken crates. But in the far corner, near where Margaret had found the wooden token, the floor looked disturbed again. Thomas lifted the lantern higher. "There," Eleanor said quietly. "Something is buried." They walked closer. The ground had been dug up recently. The dirt was loose and uneven. Margaret knelt down and brushed aside a small mound of earth. A piece of fabric appeared. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. "Pull it out," Margaret whispered. Thomas reached down, grabbed the edge of the fabric, and lifted. When the dirt fell away, a small bundle wrapped in old cloth appeared. The shape was wrong, too round at one end. Too stiff. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Ruth turned her face into Gerald's coat. "Open it," Eleanor said, almost afraid of her own words. Thomas unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside was a doll, but not a normal doll. It was hand-sewn, with black button eyes and long strands of dark thread for hair. And on its chest was carved the same symbol they saw on the tree. The circle with the cross. "This is not a child's toy," Margaret whispered. "This is used in rituals. Old rituals." Eleanor felt her heart beating faster. She looked around the cellar. The shadows seemed to move at the corners of her vision. The air felt colder. Suddenly the lantern flickered. Then it went out. Darkness swallowed the cellar. Ruth screamed. Margaret cursed under her breath. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's arm, her pulse racing. Thomas shook the lantern, trying to relight it. Nothing happened. Then Eleanor heard it. A soft sound. A woman humming. The same humming Ruth had heard outside. It came from the far end of the cellar. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor whispered. Everyone nodded, frozen in place. The humming grew louder. It sounded sweet at first, almost like a lullaby. But beneath it was something sharp, something wrong. A cold feeling ran down Eleanor's spine. "Light it," Thomas said through clenched teeth. "Light it now." Margaret struck a match. The flame burst to life, casting a small circle of light around them. And in that moment, they saw her. A woman standing at the far wall. Her dress was long and black, soaked at the bottom as if she had walked through water. Her hair hung in long wet strands over her face. She held something in her hands. Another doll. The humming stopped. The woman lifted her head slowly. Her face was pale. Her eyes were dark pits, endless and hollow. She looked directly at Eleanor. Eleanor stepped backward, but her foot hit a loose stone. She stumbled, nearly falling. The woman began to move forward. Her feet did not make a sound. Her steps were slow but determined, as if she already knew none of them could escape. Thomas pulled Eleanor behind him. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice trembled. The woman stopped in the middle of the room. She tilted her head, studying them. Then she opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not human. It was a low groan mixed with a whisper, like many voices speaking at once. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. Ruth sobbed. Gerald pulled her close. Margaret raised the match higher, but the woman flinched at the light. Her body twisted in a strange way, like she was trying to pull away from the flame. "It is the light," Margaret whispered. "She does not like it." Thomas grabbed the lantern and tried again. This time the flame caught. The lantern glowed bright, and the woman stepped back, snarling quietly. Eleanor felt a spark of hope. "Move toward her," Margaret said. "Make her go back." They walked forward slowly, holding the lantern high. The woman retreated step by step, her dark eyes burning with anger. She reached the wall behind her. And then, like smoke, she faded into the stone. Just gone. Ruth covered her ears. Eleanor felt the cold air closing in again. The cellar seemed to breathe. Thomas pointed toward the disturbed ground. "Someone buried something else here. We need to dig it up." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Not tonight. We need daylight. Whatever she is, darkness gives her strength." Eleanor nodded. She felt drained, as if the encounter had taken something from her. They climbed the stairs quickly, shutting the cellar door behind them. When they reached the main floor, Gerald locked the door. Thomas moved a chair in front of it. Margaret leaned her head against the wall. "She is protecting something down there. Something she does not want us to find." Eleanor looked at each of their faces. They were terrified, exhausted, and yet determined. "Then we find it tomorrow," she said. "And we end this." But as she spoke, the house groaned loudly. A long, deep sound that traveled through the floorboards. Almost like the house was laughing. Part 9. Engaging hook. Some secrets hide in the ground. Others hide in blood. But the worst secrets are the ones that refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave or how old the lie. The sun rose pale and weak the next morning. It did not warm the house or lift the fog that rested over the yard. The fog moved strangely, curling around the trees like fingers trying to hold onto something. Eleanor watched it from the front window, arms wrapped around herself. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the woman in the cellar with her dark hollow eyes and wet dress. She heard the humming again in her dreams and woke with her heart racing. Margaret entered the room carrying a cup of coffee that smelled strong enough to wake the dead. "It is morning," Margaret said softly. "We go back down today." Eleanor nodded, even though her stomach twisted at the thought. Thomas and Gerald came from the back hallway a moment later. Both looked worn, tense, ready for something bad. Ruth followed, quiet and pale, clutching the wooden doll they had found. She said it helped her sleep. No one understood why, but they let her keep it. "We stay together," Thomas said. "No wandering, no separating, no matter what we hear." They all agreed. Before returning to the cellar, Margaret insisted they search the house first. She believed the woman might have left another sign. A message or a warning. Something they needed to understand before they disturbed the ground again. They moved room to room carefully. The kitchen was untouched. The dining room held nothing new. The upstairs bedrooms were cold but empty. Then they reached the nursery. The room still contained 3 old cribs covered by sheets. A rocking chair sat near the window. The rocking chair was moving. Slowly. Back and forth. No wind touched it. Ruth grabbed Gerald's hand. Eleanor stepped back, her breath stuck in her throat. Thomas approached the chair and placed his hand on it. The chair stopped instantly, as if someone had just stood up and walked away. Margaret lifted the sheet on the nearest crib. Under it lay another doll. This one was smaller, with dark red thread for hair and a face stitched with uneven lines that almost looked like a mouth sewn shut. Her voice trembled. "These are not just dolls. These are offerings." "Offerings to what?" Gerald asked. Margaret did not answer. They left the nursery and made their way back to the main floor. The cellar door looked darker than the rest of the hallway, even with the sunlight coming in through the windows. Eleanor felt a chill. She knew something waited for them below. Something that had been waiting for years. Thomas unlocked the door and lifted the lantern. "Ready?" he asked. "No," Eleanor whispered honestly. "But we go anyway." They descended the stairs together. The cellar looked the same as before. Cold, silent, expectant. The place where the woman had appeared seemed darker than the rest. Margaret lit 2 extra candles and placed them on the ground. "Light is our only protection," she reminded them. The disturbed ground in the corner looked even more uneven, as if something had been digging from below. Eleanor swallowed hard. "We dig here," Thomas said. "Gerald, help me." Gerald nodded. They grabbed old shovels from the wall and began moving the dirt carefully. Margaret watched every movement closely, afraid of what they might uncover. Ruth held the lantern steady, though her hands trembled. Eleanor knelt beside Margaret. She felt the air growing colder the deeper they dug, almost as if something was rising toward them. After a few minutes, Gerald's shovel hit something hard. Everyone froze. Thomas brushed away the dirt with his hand. A piece of wood appeared. A box. Small, old, buried deep. "Lift it," Margaret whispered. Gerald pulled it free. The box was nailed shut. Dark stains covered the lid. Eleanor felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "Open it," Thomas said. Gerald pried the nails loose. The lid creaked as he lifted it. Inside lay a bundle of cloth wrapped tightly around something. Eleanor reached in slowly and pulled back the cloth. Inside was a book. Not a printed book. A handwritten journal. The cover was leather, cracked with age. On the first page was a name. Catherine Warfield. Margaret gasped. This was her house. This was her land. And this was her family. "Open it," she whispered. Eleanor turned to the first page. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, like someone writing in fear. "I have sinned beyond forgiveness. The others have sinned with me. We have done this to protect our families, but the cost is too great. The spirits we called will not leave us. They want our blood. They want our children. They want what we stole from them." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She wrote more, Margaret said. "Turn the page." Eleanor obeyed. "We used Joseph. We used him in ways no man should ever be used. We took his body for our children. We took his freedom for our safety. Now the spirits of the ones before us walk this house. They warned us. They showed us signs. We did not listen." Thomas rubbed his face. Spirits. Rituals. This was a confession. Eleanor kept reading. "I see her now. The woman who watches. She follows me. She waits near the cellar stairs. She hums to the children at night. She buries their dolls when they die. She wants the truth to rise." Margaret's voice shook. "This is why she is here. She is not haunting us. She is guarding the truth." Eleanor turned a final page. "If someone finds this, you must finish what we could not. You must give back what we took. Only then will she rest." The lantern light flickered suddenly. The air grew colder. Eleanor looked up slowly. The woman stood at the far end of the cellar again. But this time she looked different. Her face was no longer empty. Her eyes held something fierce and grieving. She stepped closer, the sound of her wet dress leaving marks on the stone floor. Ruth dropped the lantern. It clattered but stayed lit. Margaret whispered, "She wants the journal." The woman lifted her hand. Slowly, waiting, Eleanor held the book to her chest. Her heart pounded. Her breath shook. She stepped forward. As she did, the woman's expression softened. Pain, sadness, a plea for release. Eleanor held out the journal. The woman reached for it. But before she could touch it, the house groaned violently. The walls shook. The candles blew out. A roar rose from the ground beneath them. Something darker than shadow poured from the cracks in the cellar floor. "No," Margaret whispered. "Something else is down here. Something far worse." The woman looked at them with sudden fear. Then she pointed behind Eleanor. And the ground split open. Part 10. The Final Revelation. Engaging hook. Some stories refuse to stay buried. Some sins demand to be remembered. And some secrets, once uncovered, can change everything we thought we knew about the past. This is the final chapter of a story that haunted a plantation for decades, a story that could still whisper to us today. The cellar shook violently, dust falling from the low beams. Eleanor and the others clutched each other, the journal pressed against her chest. The crack in the floor widened, revealing a darkness that seemed to stretch into the center of the earth. From that darkness, a cold wind rose, carrying a scent of damp soil and something more ancient, something that smelled of sorrow and rage. The woman with the wet dress stepped closer, her eyes no longer hollow but full of urgency. She did not speak, but her presence demanded action. Margaret whispered, "She wants us to finish it. To reveal the truth and set it right." Eleanor took a trembling breath. She turned to Thomas and Gerald. We have to do what she says. Whatever she wants, we must follow. The journal lay open in her hands. Margaret read aloud from the final pages. Every word burned in the cold air of the cellar. We have hidden the bloodline, the children, the arrangement that no one could speak of. We have silenced the father, Joseph, and corrupted the mothers. The spirits of those wronged wait for justice. They will not rest until the truth is known, until the names of those who carried our secret into future generations are remembered, until the children of the present understand what began in this house. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. They were not just talking about one family. They were talking about the invisible threads that connected dozens of lives, stretching across generations. Ruth clutched the small doll to her chest. The doll's stitched mouth seemed to twitch in the flickering candlelight. She said softly, "How do we fix it?" Margaret stepped forward, holding the journal. "We tell the story. We record it. Every child, every family, every lie that has been maintained. Only when the world knows can the spirits rest." Thomas shook his head. "What if people do not believe us? What if we are accused of madness?" Margaret's eyes were firm. "They will believe because it is true. The truth has power, even if it terrifies." The woman in the wet dress moved to the far corner of the cellar. She raised her hand and pointed to a small trap door that had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Eleanor lifted the edge, revealing a narrow stair that led to a small chamber below. The air was colder here, thicker, almost alive. Inside the chamber were remnants of the past. Old letters, faded with age, tied in bundles with thread. Ledger books with names, dates, and notes about the children born to each family. Personal journals of the midwives who had assisted in the births. Everything carefully documented but hidden away for decades. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. Every secret, every detail, had been preserved, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. She picked up one of the ledgers. The handwriting was cramped, precise, legal. Names of children, their mothers, dates of birth, and notes in the margins about their health and appearance. The same patterns that had haunted the Warfield estate for decades were all here. Joseph's name appeared repeatedly, always in the margins, a silent witness to the arrangement. The woman's eyes met Eleanor's. "Do it," her gaze commanded. "Set it free." Eleanor began reading aloud, recording every name, every date, every fact in a notebook they had brought. Thomas and Gerald kept watch, their faces pale but resolute. Ruth sat quietly, listening, absorbing. The truth. The woman drifted around the room, occasionally brushing the edges of their candles with her damp dress, almost as if approving their work. Hours passed. Every page turned felt like lifting a veil. Every name written brought a weight and a release. Finally, Eleanor closed the last ledger and looked around the chamber. The woman was smiling now, faintly, as if the burden had lifted from her shoulders. She moved toward the trapdoor and paused. She raised her hand one last time and then stepped backward into the shadows. In an instant, she was gone. The coldness lifted slightly, and the cellar felt warmer, lighter, freer. Margaret exhaled slowly. The story was now in their hands. They could take it to historians, to newspapers, to the families involved. The truth could no longer be hidden. Eleanor looked down at the journal and the ledgers. For decades, these papers had survived fires, floods, and attempts to seal them away. Now, they would finally see the light. The voices of the past would be heard. As they climbed the stairs, the fog outside had lifted. Sunlight touched the Warfield house for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the lawn. Eleanor knew that the story they carried would not be easy for anyone to hear. It was a story of betrayal, of cruelty, and of a system that allowed one man to control lives across generations. But it was also a story of survival, of courage, and of truth finally breaking free. Margaret turned to Eleanor and whispered, "This is why we came here. This is why we stayed. Some secrets are too powerful to remain buried. Some voices too important to silence." Eleanor nodded, and she understood. The Warfield estate would continue to stand, but its legacy had been forever changed. The children, descendants, and families involved could no longer claim ignorance. The past had been uncovered, and history would now remember it exactly as it was. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the faint scent of earth and water and something else. Eleanor smiled slightly. The woman, the guardian of truth, was finally at rest. As the group walked down the path toward the road, Eleanor turned to the camera, imagining the audience watching from miles away. History is not always clean. History is not always kind. But history is real, and the truths we uncover, even the horrifying ones, shape the world we live in today. If you want to know more stories like this, stories that expose hidden truths, leave a comment with your state, subscribe for more, and share this video with friends who love history, mystery, and the unexplained. Every story deserves to be heard. Every secret deserves to be revealed. And remember, the past is always closer than you think.